Thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation on beer feature optimization, a project that was completed by Becca Barnett, Jessica Chow, Caroline Chisholm, Andrew Twitty, and Rob Quell as a part of an independent consulting firm focused on helping to support a grocery store chain with optimizing their beer sales. What you'll find in this presentation today is a little bit of background into the beer industry, the problem that we were attempting to solve, our strategy and analysis of how we diagnose that problem, and ultimately a recommendation that will help to drive additional sales revenue for this grocery store. So first, let's talk a little bit about the beer industry. It's an industry that's driven by a high amount of advertising dollars, a very intensely changing landscape over the last couple of years, and a market that's ultimately highly competitive. What you'll find is that the beer market represents over $107 billion in revenue each year, and the craft beer market has been an increasing amount of that beer revenue. There's over 5,300 breweries across the U.S. as of 2016, and that number continues to increase exponentially, up over 16.6% from the prior year, and advertising represents approximately $1.6 billion, predominantly driven by a lot of the macro brewing companies like Anheuser-Busch, Molson Coors, and a number of others. So, as far as trends occurring in this industry, you'll find that beer sales ultimately have actually been decreasing relative to other alcohol distributors, such as the liquor market. They've lost market share for the seventh straight year in 2016. We mentioned that this is a highly competitive market with a significant number of entrants and now really limited product differentiation across the beer market. And again, craft beer is really driving a lot of that increase, with them experiencing over double-digit growth for 2 consecutive years. So we'll start really quickly by just analyzing what the problem was that we were trying to solve. So as we looked at about 1 year's worth of sales data across 52 different brands of beers, ranging in package options, different beers that were advertised in features, as well as holiday and seasonality impacts, what we identified is that a lot of features in terms of advertising these beers in local advertising opportunities in newspapers and discount ads and things like that, we really weren't highlighting the most optimal brands and the brands that were going to respond best to those advertising efforts from an overall sales and revenue perspective. So what we did was we analyzed this beer sales from running over 100 different regression models, and we noticed that there was a significant correlation between which beers were featured in those periodicals and the overall sales volume that was generated from those beers. Based on isolating that variable, we ran additional regression models on each individual beer that had been featured. So about 34 of the 52 beers that were sold through this grocery store, and then ultimately used that data to offer a recommendation in order to maximize sales by optimizing those features. So first, starting with some assumptions that we made, this store has used as many feature promotions as they could afford, and that they're going to use about the same number of features next year. So we're not trying to increase or decrease marketing spend. We're simply trying to highlight how allocating that marketing spend toward featuring certain beers over others would impact their overall sales revenue. Additionally, we're also assuming that there is additional market demand for the beers that currently exists, and that this allocation will not cannibalize the current sales. We recognize that this is probably a broad assumption, and that there will be some cannibalization, which will ultimately detract a little bit away from the revenue recommendations that we demonstrate. However, with only having 1 year of data, we didn't feel as though this would be a significant barrier to our recommendation. And then finally, we also assume that moving features from one beer to another would not change the overall behavior or correlations of those influencing sales. So we assume that there would not be a diminishing impact of those marketing efforts or those promotion efforts on the overall sales, and that they would continue to perform, again, normally compared to the data set that we have. Now, again, this would recognize that some of the revenue recommendations probably won't be quite as high as what we've highlighted in this presentation, but still feel as though that they will have a meaningful lift. So first, doing initial analysis, we ran a number of different regression models across all of the beer sales. And what we found was, across a number of different factors, one of the most significant correlations to higher sales volumes was in fact marketing efforts, and specifically within those marketing efforts, the feature of those beers, whether they were in periodicals or promoting them out within the marketplace to consumers. So that's really where we focused a lot of our effort and where we came to the feature recommendation. As we ran a single variable regression on each beer that was featured, and we've listed in this chart only beers that were featured more than 10 times, we found that there was, through the adjusted R-squared column, we found that there were beers that responded and that their sales correlated very nicely to the feature. So you see, Michelob Light, Bass Pale Ale, and Smutty Nose IPA correlated very nicely, where their sales volume when a feature occurred was significantly higher, and that was a big driver into the overall sales of those beers. We also found that there were several, such as Heineken, Michelob Ultra, and Bud Light Lime, where there was very little correlation between the feature when those beers were featured and the actual sales volume or the impact on those sales volumes. So this is where we really started our analysis. And then we evaluated each individual beer. So we actually conducted regression analysis on each beer to determine how a number of these different variables would impact the overall sales volume, which will lead to how we were able to project the additional revenue that could be driven. So we analyzed and built a regression formula that based the overall sales on a base rate, which occurred and just existed across all the beers, and then a number of different factors, including the price, primarily driven by cents per ounce, whether or not there was a special holiday week in that week, seasonal implications such as the summer, spring, autumn or winter, and then whether it was featured in local advertisements, whether it was on a special display within that store, and the overall special price reductions or discounts or coupons that might have been applied during that time period. So as we ran this model, just for an example, for Bud Light, we found that our model was fairly accurate. You have an adjusted R-squared value of 0.71, which is fairly significant. And then again, you can see down at the bottom where features was a primary driver with a statistical value of a very small p, which would suggest that this is very statistically significant, especially for the feature. So with that, we ran regression models and conducted this on every single beer that was featured, so all 34 beers, and you can see that summarized in the table on the screen. Here you can see for the beers that we focused on, we had adjusted R-squared values ranging from 0.71 to 0.52, and all of the p-values suggested that it was significant from a statistics perspective. So then what we looked at was what the additional revenue would be driven by adding one additional feature based on applying those overall individual beer regression formulas. And you can see from this chart that beers on the far left, like Sam Adams Seasonal, Bud Light, Coors Light, and Miller Lite, would drive significant additional revenue versus beers down toward the bottom, such as McKinsey's Hard Cider, would drive almost minimal additional revenue. So from there, we made a recommendation to shift features. There were, of the beers that were featured in this data set, Twisted Tea, Hard Iced Tea, Bud Light Lime, and Michelob Light were not driving meaningful revenue based on featuring those beers. And you can see over the course of the next couple slides where we have highlighted specifically within the chart where those individual beers were and recommended shifting them toward higher responding beers such as Sam Adams, Bud Light, Coors Light, and Miller Lite. So ultimately, when you take this approach, so if you were to, example, take the Twisted Tea and shift all of those 15 features that you did on Twisted Tea toward Sam Seasonal, which was one of the top responding beers to that feature variable, you can see just that one shift alone could potentially generate an additional $34,000 of revenue from a sales perspective. So simply by highlighting these three individual beers, from Twisted Tea to Sam Seasonal, from Bud Light Lime to Bud Light and staying within that Bud Light family, and then from Michelob Light to Miller Lite or Coors Light, again staying within those light beers, you can see that this initial recommendation just with these handful of beers could generate an additional $67,170 of sales revenue for the grocery store. Now, again, we noted some assumptions at the very beginning, which is that this assumes incremental demand exists for these beers, and that the impact of these features does not overall diminish or change with increased utilization, and there's not a diminishing return on marketing. And this was based on a limited time set. However, we find that this recommendation would be very meaningfully impactful to the overall revenue that this grocery store could generate, and ultimately would recommend that you hire us as a consulting firm to continue to do additional data exploration and make recommendations in order to drive significant revenue. We'd like to thank you again for your time, and we hope you have a great rest of the day.